Welcome, listeners, to the American Civil War episode of History to Wargames podcast, a podcast dedicated to bringing the American Civil War history to the listener through visits to battlefields, reenactments, live history events, and interviews with authors of this period. The visual spectacle of historic wargaming may also be discussed to further understand the choices made by the generals of this period. So let us blend for you the history to wargames in this podcast and provide some unique insight into the American Civil War. Welcome, listeners, to the History to Wargames podcast. Today we have a special podcast. It's going to be about historical fiction. And we all know the author back in the 90s, and they based the movie on Gettysburg, and then they did Gods and Generals, Jeff Shaara. Well, just recently, after my visit to Frankland, I had a friend tell me about a book called Die Like Men, and it was about the Frankland Campaign, and it's a historical fiction novel, book. Pretty much you take history and you put the words into the mouth of the generals and the colonels and the men that were on the field, and kind of give it more of a perspective, a personal perspective of the decisions being made at the time. And we can all read our dry history books, but when you get to historical fiction, I think a lot of us have read historical fiction in the past, and it just really captivates you and pulls you through the book and through the story of that period of time and the decisions being made, just like we always, as we talk about, of trying to make decisions like it happened 150 years ago. So I'd like to welcome to the podcast Tim Kent, the author of Die Like Men. Welcome, Tim.
Glad to be here.
Hey, it's great to have you. Where are you from? What part of the states are you from?
I live in northwest Alabama, Muscle Shoals area, Tuscumbia.
Okay.
I guess Tuscumbia is famous for the birthplace of Helen Keller.
Oh, Helen Keller. So that just jumps right into a story about Frankland. Did her father fight at Frankland?
Her father was a captain of the 27th Alabama Infantry and at Frankland, and he's also a quartermaster guy, which is basically like a supply guy today.
Sure, yeah.
So he doesn't have to go into battle at Frankland, but they've got a company without a captain, and he volunteers to lead them in.
Wow.
And they actually make the charge. He's shot in the neck and bayoneted. They find him on the battlefield the next day. They pick him up and throw him into the trenches to bury him. And they buried these guys in mass graves in the trenches that were right there.
Yep.
They throw him in there. They hear him grunt. And they say, well, this guy's alive. They pull him back out. They take him to the hospital. They don't think he'll live. And he pulls through. And if he would have gotten killed there, we'd have never heard of Helen Keller.
That's just that story I bumped into about a month ago, and I'm glad we started out with that. That's just an amazing story. And that whole Helen Keller story that happens after that and his daughter is just amazing. Just amazing story. So yeah. Start out. Tell us a little bit about the book. How did you come up with the inception of it, and when did it all start for you?
Oh, it all started when I was about 6 years old. I had a great uncle and an uncle. They're no longer living, but my uncle was my dad's youngest brother. He was about as close in age to me as he was my dad. And I would, I'm saying like halfway between. And they would, he lived with my grandparents. And when my great uncle would come visit, they would rehash the war. And I would sit and listen to these stories just.
Which war? World War II?
The Civil War.
Civil War. Wow.
Always Civil War. Yeah.
Okay.
My uncle was big in the Civil War, and my great uncle, I guess he liked talking about it. I don't know if he was into it as my uncle, but Bruce Catton, the book the one he wrote, The
Sure.
Civil War.
Yeah.
My uncle had that. I can't tell you when I was a kid how many times I went through that book, looking at pictures and just going through it and going through it and going through it, and it just stuck for some reason. He was also into Native Americans, but that just wasn't my thing. The Civil War is the one that just stuck. it's a whole new game when you're fighting against yourselves.
Yes.
Kind of see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's a book. To be honest, I looked at that book when I was young, also, and most Civil War buffs and even Civil War historians, amateur historians, even professional historians have all seen that book, and we've all flipped through that same book. It inspires us at a young age, and then we continue on from that age, taking it into our adult life, and keep being inspired by the history of the Civil War. So we started with that book. Guys are telling stories. Relatives are telling stories. Cousins, uncles. It's all the same. I feel like it's the same thread that threads us all together in Civil War history.
Yeah.
So you kind of go.
And it's still so divisive today, 150 years later, and we're still arguing about it.
Yeah, that's so true.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's so true. When did you? So then, I'm sure at your young growing up and stuff, you saw the battlefields, you went through all the different things and those kind of things. Is that kind of how you grew up also?
Yeah. I live about an hour from Shiloh, and I can't tell you how many times we've been there. And then I'm reading, when I'm about 17, I cannot remember the book. I wish I could. I'm reading a book, and this guy's talking about the Battle of Franklin and how bloody it was, and then he mentions this red-haired Irish general getting killed there, and the guy's name's Pat Claiborne, and of course I've got red hair, so I said, okay, I got to find out more about this guy. So I start studying Pat Claiborne. Well, now, this is a side note. I've started major argument with a guy. Well, not really a major argument because I don't know, but this guy says no, his hair wasn't red, it was brown, and I've read descriptions where they say it's brown, and some say it's kind of changed in the sunlight, looked red, whatever. But, it wasn't worth me arguing with this historian over, so I'm just saying, okay, you're right, whatever. But anyway, that's how he became my favorite general. And that's, I've been to Franklin so many times, and it's actually where I took my wife on our first date. So, she knew what she was getting into before we got married.
There you go.
But, Pat Claiborne's standing on this hill, and he realizes, this is bad. This is going to be bad. This is ugly. And he's a major general, commands a division, and a brigade commander, Govan, is standing there, Daniel Govan. And they're both from Arkansas. And Govan looks down there right before the order to charge is given. He says, well, it don't look like many of us will get back to Arkansas after today. And Pat Claiborne says, well, Govan, if we're to die, let's die like men. And so that's where I came up with the name of the book.
Oh, it's fantastic. That's just it's such a great, it's those chosen words he always has, and it's that story that's gone through lifetimes to talk about. When did you start writing the book?
I started the book I researched for the book probably 3-4 years worth of hard research, but I started the book in 2010, and she published it. I can't even remember the date it was published. Let me see here. It published 2011.
Okay.
But I had most of it written before I went and talked to the lady about publishing it. But I wanted it. It's historical fiction, but I will say this: I wanted it as accurate as possible. I didn't want it. The only thing I did is, of course, if anybody's read the official records, you realize how these guys talked back then. They didn't talk anything like we talk, and so I kind of modernized the language so it's more understandable. And the way they just gave orders, it's no wonder there was so much confusion on the battlefield, because the way they would, just take Lee at Gettysburg when he tells Ewell, if practical, take Culp's Hill on the first day. And here's Ewell over here saying, well, what does that mean? I'm expecting the order, take it or don't take it, and I get if practical. So it was a lot of that stuff that went on. And so I tried to simplify and go with what I think they really meant. And the difficult thing with this book is you have to go through Spring Hill, which is also, the great unsolved mystery of the Civil War people are still arguing over what happened there and why it was so catastrophic. He actually had the Federal Army, 25,000 men, where he wanted them, and he could have destroyed them. And what I tell people when I do speaking engagements, I said, it's like lining up dominoes, and you tip one over, something that should never happen, and it tips another one, and this could have never happened in 1,000 years again, the way it all played out. It was just like, there's a blunder, a minor blunder, nothing, then another, to the point that it would actually have been hilarious if it didn't cost so many people their lives the next day.
Yeah. Tell us really quick, in a quick couple-minute synopsis of Spring Hill. I had never heard of it till I went to Franklin. Tell us really quick what happened and how it got set up.
Well, let me back up a little bit and explain about Hood a little bit.
Sure.
Hood,
yes,
you know, he was in Longstreet's corps, the first part of the war in Lee's command. But now Longstreet was a defensive fighter, and Hood was an offensive fighter, and so. But he studies, you know, he admired Lee. He was under Lee, a lieutenant in Texas, in the old U.S. Army, and he'd always looked up to Lee, and Lee was his hero. And he watched all these accomplishments Lee and Jackson made with these flanking maneuvers, and that got in his head. So when he actually gets in command of the Army of Tennessee, and Sherman's at Atlanta. Every maneuver he made at Atlanta, people say, oh, he's a butcher. He just kept making frontal assaults. Well, no. His problem was he tried to be a Lee, but he didn't have a Jackson. He sent Hardee, who was called over-reliable, but he was no Jackson. He sent S.D. Lee on flanking marches. He made all these flanking maneuvers, and every time, somebody dropped the ball. Now, by the time he gets to Columbia, Tennessee, the Federal Army is on the other side of the Duck River, dug in, under Schofield. And Hood realizes, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to leave S.D. Lee's corps here, and I'm going to take the other two corps, and I'm going to march east around his flank to Spring Hill in his rear and cut him off from Nashville, and then I'm going to capture him. But I'm going to do things different this time because my subordinates always drop the ball. So I'm going to go with them and make sure it's done right. So you think, okay, well, this is, it should work out. The problem is he's exhausted. He was so excited. He called this move the greatest move on the chessboard of war. He said this was this was going to be my greatest ever military maneuver. I was going to be famous for it. And so he slept like 2 hours that night. He'd been up all day, slept 2 hours that night, gets up like 1 a.m., can't sleep, goes with them. And, he had a leg missing at Chickamauga. He had like 2 inches of his femur left, of his right leg. His left arm's pretty much useless, so they have to strap him in. At Gettysburg, he gets a bicep mostly blown off, and his left arm's useless, so they have to strap him in the saddle. And on their way up there, he starts getting second thoughts. He's afraid that Schofield's going to attack him in the flank, so he forces Brown's entire division to march through the woods, and you can imagine how tiring that is. And when he gets to Spring Hill, he sets the perfect trap. He leaves Stewart's corps on the flank, facing the turnpike that Schofield's going to be retreating up, and he tells Cheatham, go put your corps across the road facing south, so that when Schofield comes up, he's going to engage Cheatham trying to break through to escape, and then he's going to pull a perfect Chancellorsville and have A.P. Stewart come crashing in on his flank and wipe Schofield out. I mean, it was beautiful. It was a beautiful maneuver. But, like I said, he says, I'm going to go with him and make sure it's done right. And he gets up there and he's so exhausted that he rides over to a place called Oak Lawn and dismounts in the driveway beside a pond and sits on a log. And he's just too tired he don't feel like going on, so he's just basically let his subordinates take care of it. He tells Cheatham, get your corps across the road. Well, Cheatham, and somehow he gets mixed up thinking Spring Hill is the goal, which Spring Hill is another 2 miles north of where they're at. And so he ends up trying to take the town instead of getting across the pike. One of Cheatham's divisions comes up, Bate, and he sees Hood, and he says, "Where do you want me?" He says, "Put your division across the road. Make sure you get across the road." Well, he gets to the road, and Cheatham comes down there and orders him to move up on Claiborne's flank, facing Spring Hill. Takes him completely away from the road. So his entire corps is basically facing the town of Spring Hill, more or less perpendicular to the road. And Hood hears firing because Claiborne has attacked. I mean, they were on his flank. He attacks. There's only like 2 brigades there. He attacks them. He's driving them all the way back to Spring Hill. They're guarding the supply wagons. And Cheatham calls him off and says, "Stop your attack till I get the rest of the corps online, and then we'll go in together." That was the first domino. The second domino, he tells Bate, "You come up and help Claiborne." Brown comes online on the right. There's rumors that Brown was intoxicated that night, and he got off his horse and lay down on a blanket and used his saddle for a pillow and refused to move. And Cheatham tells Brown, "As soon as your division's online, you attack." And he goes and tells Claiborne, "When you hear Brown attack, you attack." And he tells Bate, "When Claiborne attacks, you attack." Well, Brown never attacks. He lost his nerve, or was intoxicated, or something. We'll never know for sure, but there were several people that insisted Brown was intoxicated that night. So they sit there and fool around, and it's done got dark. When Cheatham rides up to Hood, and Hood says, "Have you got your men across the pike yet?" And Cheatham says, No, I hadn't got across the pike yet." And Hood said, "I have ordered you and ordered you and ordered you. What's going on?" And he says, I can't, my flank won't reach far enough." And which is a bold-faced lie. Hood thinks he's tried to get across the pike, and he's facing southwest toward Columbia. He's not. He's facing northeast toward Spring Hill. So Hood actually asked him, said, "If I bring Stewart's corps across Rutherford Creek and put him on your right, will he be across the pike?" Well, Cheatham says, yeah, I believe he will, yeah. So that he thinks that's getting him out of any blame. So once Stewart comes across the creek and forms on Cheatham's right, he's still running perpendicular to the pike. And 25,000 Federal troops under Schofield marched past those Confederate troops, and they weren't in places 100 yards off the road, and escaped that night. And historians have had all kind of theories, but from the best I can gather, what I've just told you is what happened, and it was just ridiculous. As one guy told me, if you've got to take your subordinates by the hand and lead them and put them in their positions, then you got the wrong guys as subordinates. I mean, what's their job? You tell them where to go and what to do, and they're supposed to do it. But there was a lot went on with that. I mean, you got to think these guys hadn't been in Tennessee in over a year. They're coming back. Even General Chalmers said every citizen you passed was passing them up canteens of whiskey. So who knows what kind of shape they were in that night?
Yeah, no, that's a great look at Spring Hill, actually. And if you're confused, listener, a little bit about how this looks, please just Google it really quick.
I could give you a map.
Yeah, it's hard to say a map over audio. And the biggest thing that I noticed about Spring Hill, I forget if it was a division or brigade, they lined up right on the road facing due west, right? They deployed in the line due west, thinking the enemy was in front of them. Which division was that?
That was Bate, and he was where Hood put him, and Cheatham moved.
Well, the thing is, he's on the road. He kind of comes off the road, deploys straight in the line facing due west, and he starts marching across the field. The next thing you know, he's taking rifle fire from the right flank, and has to.
That's Claiborne.
Oh, Claiborne. Yep, and Claiborne has to shift right, and then moved
He's forced.
directly
And
north.
he had his brigade set up to shift left across the pike.
Right.
And he's got to completely readjust his division to shift right, which puts him moving towards Spring Hill.
Yep.
But now when Bate comes up next, Hood tells him, go west, get across the road.
Yeah.
He gets to the road when Cheatham sends him an order and says, go help Claiborne up there to the north.
Yep. And again, changes direction, goes north, and goes away from the road again. So.
Right. And here's Hood with, he's got about 28,000 troops on the field, and he can't get one of them where he wants them.
Yeah, and all he's doing is fighting rear guard cavalry, pretty much with artillery up on a hill near Spring Hill. So.
Yeah, it wasn't much there. It was 2 brigades of infantry and a little bit of cavalry.
Yep.
Forrest had mostly just wiped their cavalry out at that point. They were out of the action. And you know Forrest, he was a genius, but as he said before, he never requisitioned the Confederate government for anything he had. Everything he had U.S. stamped all over it. And he gets to Spring Hill before the infantry, and he sees all of these 25,000 troops worth of supply wagons in town, and he tells General Chalmers, go in there and get those wagons. And Chalmers says, I don't think that's going to work. So that's infantry guarding them. They're behind. They'd made barricades of fence rails, and Forrest insists, oh no, it's a little cavalry. Go on in there and get them. So Chalmers goes in there and gets a bunch of good guys killed, and says he rides back up on the hill, and Forrest said, well, they were in there sure enough, wasn't they? So he kind of admitted he was wrong, but I mean, he could just taste those wagons.
Yeah, and there was a lot of wagons. There's 300 wagons, wasn't there? I think they were on there.
At least, yeah, at least. I mean, there was 25,000 men worth, and Schofield was nervous. He actually tutored Hood at West Point in math. All these guys knew each other. Yeah.
So tell us really quick, where does your book start? Does it start with Spring Hill?
It starts. I start them in Tuscumbia. This is where they left from, here where I live.
Okay.
And they cross the river into Florence, and then they move out and they move north. And I wanted to do that because Davis hated Beauregard, but after all the blundering around Atlanta, the people were calling for Hood to be removed. So instead of removing Hood, he says, Beauregard, you're in charge of Hood's army, but you can't give them orders. Does that make sense?
Like he was like a chief of staff, wasn't he, or something along those lines?
Yeah, well, he was a full general, but he said, you're in charge of Hood's army. You're in charge. See, Davis was big into these departments. You're in charge of the department, but you cannot give Hood a direct order in the field. Was basically. So, I mean, what good is it? Basically, all Beauregard did was try to keep Hood's army supplied the best he could. Railroads were all torn up, and they actually had an argument here in Tuscumbia. That's where the book kind of starts, with them arguing. And Beauregard's wanting him to hurry and go, because, see, Sherman has taken the best part of his army, and he's marching across Georgia, and he puts George Thomas in Nashville and says, here, round up what you can. He's got 5,000 black troops that have never seen action in Chattanooga. He's got 5,000 troops in Decatur, Alabama, in garrison duty. He's got about 15,000 or 10,000 in Murfreesboro. He don't even have an army. He's building an army, and he's waiting for another 15,000 troops out of Missouri to get there by boat. And then he's got Schofield, where he mistakenly places him in Pulaski, thinking that Hood had to go through Pulaski to get to Nashville, and Hood went straight to Columbia, which bypasses Pulaski. So Schofield, and that's why I started there, because I have the race between Schofield and Hood trying to get back to Columbia, and Schofield beats him. Then I have the flank maneuver at Spring Hill, and then I go on and we do Franklin, of course, and then I went ahead and included Nashville and what happened there, and it was all ugly.
Yeah, sure. But really quick, so in the beginning of the book, you're kind of bouncing between Union commanders and Confederate commanders. Is that kind of giving that perspective?
Yeah.
Okay.
Setting up, what's going on. I go to George Thomas, and him. He was worried because, and in my opinion, in my honest opinion, I get nervous when I talk about generals because, I do a lot of Civil War talks.
Yeah.
And I was doing a talk, and I expressed my personal opinion about Joseph Johnston. thought he was one of the worst Confederate generals we ever had. He never would fight. All he did was retreated. And there's this guy I learned in the audience who that's his favorite general. So I thought I was going to have to fight to get out of there. So, in my personal opinion, George Thomas is the best, probably the best Federal commander they have. He's solid, steady, dependable, but he was worried. And one of his staff officers said that's the first time I'd ever seen him worried. And he felt kind of cheated because, you know, Sherman takes the best part of the army and leaves and says, here, you take all these scraps and keep Hood out of Kentucky and Ohio. And he's got problems. At the time Hood leaves here, he's got Schofield at Pulaski, and I think he's got like 4,000 government clerks that he's put in the trenches at Nashville, and they're not going to stop Confederate infantry. Veteran Confederate. I'm talking these guys that went on that campaign had been through the entire war. And you're not going to take a bunch of government clerks and put a rifle in their hands and expect them to stop veteran Confederate infantry. It's not going to happen. D.H. Hill once said, if I could have Federal artillery and Confederate infantry, I'd take the whole world.
So that's a great you're setting up just perfectly, because at this moment that the Confederates are about to leave your hometown, the Sherman's march has just started. So what he's trying to do is bring Sherman back from his raid, per se, to the Carolinas.
That was his goal. But Sherman had made up his mind he wasn't coming back.
But Hood didn't know that, did he? Hood didn't know.
Do what now?
Hood didn't know that Sherman might not come back. Or
was Davis, and he and Davis got together and planned this campaign, and they said, you know, Sherman will have to come back.
Yep.
But Sherman was gone. He wasn't coming back. You know, as soon as he left Atlanta, he cut all communications off because he didn't want any orders to come back.
Yeah.
He had planned for that. And actually, Lincoln and Grant both almost relieved George Thomas before the Battle of Nashville because they thought, they had it in their head that, okay, this guy's slow, he's scared to fight. But, you know, there was an ice storm. We had one here back in the 80s. It snowed like 3 inches and then sleeted on top of it. So it makes this. You're from Ohio. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have them here often. We had one in the 80s, and I'll never forget it. But you could go out and walk, and you wouldn't even crunch through to the snow because the sleet on top of it. So they had that problem in Nashville, and he kept telling them, we can't, the cavalry, the horses can't even walk on this stuff. And they were on the verge of relieving him when it finally melted off and he made the attack. Grant was actually about to get on the train and head to Nashville and relieve him personally when he learned that the attack had been made.
The attack
at Nashville.
At Nashville. Okay, yeah. So farther down the line. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
this is.
Yeah, we'll get to Nashville. I promise you. We'll show you the demise of the Confederate Army. But let us. It
was ugly.
Let's move from Spring Hill for the listeners really quick. Is there any stories that didn't quite make the book about Spring Hill really quick? Or anything that you covered that couldn't make the pages of the book, just for the listeners' sake, if they're going to go out and buy the book?
No, I actually. I'll tell you this. I had read every book I could get on about what happened at Spring Hill, and nobody had ever. I know I probably confused everybody, but my book has maps, and with what all happened, there was the key to the entire thing at Spring Hill was A.P. Stewart's report. He said, I was taken off the road, deployed in line of battle. Now, you don't take an entire corps out of march formation, deploy them in line of battle in a field facing west, if you don't plan on using them. That's a lot of work. Any book you read says, well, we don't know if Hood was trying to destroy Schofield or if he was trying to beat him to Nashville. You're not going to go to Nashville and leave 25,000 men in your rear. That just doesn't make sense. But when he had deployed A.P. Stewart's entire corps of about 15,000 men facing west, when Schofield retreats and runs into Cheatham, he's going to send A.P. Stewart right into that flank and wipe him out. He's got nowhere to go.
Right, and Stewart's quarters was actually at the Duck Creek, right, at the river there, holding them in place as these other two corps were swinging around the flank. So
they're ready to hit a flank.
Yeah.
And then he has to, of course, after Cheatham says, I can't get across the pike, he's got to pull them out of line formation, back into march formation, back on the road, cross the creek, march all the way up, and form on Cheatham's right. And by this time, it's about 9, 10 o'clock at night. And it was a mess.
Yeah,
it really was. But I'm happy to say, since I've written my book, there's a guy named James R. Knight that writes books about Tennessee battles, and he has taken my approach, which made me feel real good, because that's the first time anybody has ever suggested that he was setting up a Chancellorsville in Spring Hill. And when I read that, I said, that's the first time ever anybody has said anything near what's in my book. And, I guess a person has one moment in his life when he feels like he accomplishes something really good, and that was mine.
Yeah. No, it's great.
Somebody would actually take what I said and say, hey, this guy knows what he's talking about.
So that's perfect. So, we got Spring Hill. It's turned night for these guys. They're moving up. You've got these accounts that you have in the book. Leads us to the Battle of Frankland. Frankland is one of the most underrated battles, almost never talked about. The Confederates wake up. They wake up what? November? Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Most people realize that at Frankland, that main line right there where the cotton gin was, is considered America's bloodiest quarter mile in history. There's no battle anywhere where it got uglier than what happened in that 1/4 mile line right there.
Yeah, this is an interesting point. It leads to the Confederates wake up November 30th, and they just realize that the Union Army has escaped them, and they're all sitting in Franklin behind earthworks, right? Which leads to the title of your book, Die Like Men. Claiborne's sitting there staring out over Osborne, or what's the name of the hill? Osborne Hill?
Winstead Hill.
Winstead Hill.
Yeah.
They're all staring out there, and the whole question is, you're telling me Hood's dog-tired, he's falling asleep on a log, pretty much he's got maybe exhaustion. Maybe he's got exhaustion. What's the story about him taking drugs for his arm and his leg? What's up with that story?
I'm glad you brought that up because that's really an unfair analogy, and me and another historian named Heath Matthews have discussed this several times. When Hood returned to the Army as a Corps commander under Joseph P. Johnson, he wrote a letter to his fiancée in Richmond that I ride 30 miles a day in the saddle without the least bit of pain. I'm completely healed. I have no pain. Okay, so when we get to Spring Hill, he's exhausted, and according to Wiley Sword's book, he had to take laudanum, which is a mixture of opium and whiskey, just to go to sleep. Let me tell you something. If you have been up 48 hours and only had 2 hours sleep, you don't need anything to put you to sleep. He was so exhausted that he goes into the Thompson. Mr. Thompson owns the house, and they put him in the first room on the left, of course, because they have enough trouble getting him around with one leg. And he is so exhausted, he's out. And they actually, every time these guys, subordinates, come in and say, look, this is happening or this is happening, he can barely get awake enough to answer. He actually, there was a private that came in about midnight and said, I just want to let you know that the entire Union Army is marching right up the road right now, right past us. And he was so exhausted that he just told one of his staff officers, tell General Johnson to get his division across the road. But the story about the drugs comes up. You're going to love this. In the 1940s, a guy comes forward and says, I can tell you why the Confederates lost at Spring Hill. Hood and Claiborne were in that headquarters drunk having a party. Okay, now Claiborne didn't drink, and Hood had quit drinking when Bishop Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk baptized him earlier in the year. He had quit drinking. So neither one of those drank. Okay, so I can't even remember the name of the guy. Some historian decides, well, if he wasn't drinking, he had to be on something. So they decided it was laudanum. Now, what kind of historical work is that?
Yeah.
I mean, they just basically ruined the guy's name, and they don't have a clue. And me and Heath Matthews talked about it, and Heath Matthews said, well, if I was looking at it, I would have never said it was because they were on drugs. They might have been having withdrawals, but it wasn't drugs.
Tell us really quick about Leonidas Polk. He was a minister, wasn't he?
He was a bishop of the Episcopal Church in Louisiana, but he was Davis's roommate at West Point, which is how he got his position.
Gotcha.
He was actually Davis's top-ranked. I don't want to tell a lie here.
Yeah.
I know he was his top-ranked major general, but I can't remember if he was the top-ranked lieutenant general or not. I believe he was. But it was all through friendship. I mean, he had no combat experience.
And he died in Atlanta, didn't he?
Yeah, actually, when they were at Kennesaw Mountain, they were on Pine Mountain, and he and Joseph E. Johnston and William Hardy were walking, observing the federal positions on the side of the mountain, and Sherman happens to be on the other hill. And he tells, they've got these big Parrott rifles, 24-pounders, and he tells them, he says, there's some Confederate officers of some sort over there if you want to try to take a shot at them. And believe it or not, the first one hits him in the side and cuts him in two.
No way.
Polk.
Wow.
Just a luck shot. And Sherman had actually had given the order to do it. It's kind of odd, but I mean, strange, but
yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, and my understanding that he was part of that revival in the Confederate Army back then, when the a religious revival within the Confederate Army and stuff. Was that?
Yeah. He was not a very good commander. He had been a bishop so long that he was not used to taking orders. He was used to giving orders. So he and Bragg, okay, Chickamauga, he's told to attack at daylight, and then it rocks on there a couple of hours, and finally Bragg rides over to his headquarters and, what are you doing? He said, well, I was going to finish having breakfast first. I mean, it's just stuff like that all the time. But now, of course, we're way off the subject, but
yeah.
You don't want to get me started on Bragg, because he argued with all his officers. And basically, that's what's part of the problem with the Army at this point, is because through the entire war, this Army has been in turmoil because none of the commanders can get along. Lee's Army, what's the first words he said after Pickett's charge?
It was his fault.
It was his fault. One historian said Bragg would have choked on those words. After every failure, he started firing people, getting rid of people. Oh, it's this guy's fault. It's this guy's fault. And so these guys are scared to act. If I see an opportunity and I act and it's wrong, he's going to fire me. So they're scared. I mean, you've heard the story about Bragg in the old Army when he was a post captain out west.
No, go ahead. Tell us.
His adjutant musters out of the Army, and Bragg writes the colonel, who's over several posts there, and says, look, my adjutant's gone. I ain't got an adjutant. I need somebody to serve as my adjutant. And the guy says, well, you're just going to have to serve as post captain and post adjutant yourself until I can get you one. And Bragg says, okay. So Bragg sits down and writes this long letter and says, Adjutant Bragg, I need such and such supplies. Signs it, Captain Bragg. Then he writes himself back, Captain Bragg, I don't have any supplies to give you. Adjutant Bragg. Then he writes back, Adjutant Bragg, I must have these supplies for my men, Captain Bragg. And he gets so flustered, he takes these letters and he goes to the colonel and says, I don't know what to do, and hands the letters to him. And the colonel reads the letters and he says, my God, Mr. Bragg, you've argued with everybody in the Army, now you're arguing with yourself. That's how bad Bragg was.
That's funny.
He was famous for arguing. At Chickamauga, they got the Union Army broken and on the run. There's a Confederate private that gets captured. And as they falling back, he escapes, and he goes to Bragg's headquarters, and he said, General, I just want you to know you've whipped them. They're retreating. You need to go finish it up. And Bragg looks at him and said, how would you know what a retreat looks like? And the guy says, well, I ought to know. I've been in your Army 2 years. What can you say?
Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah, swing us back to Franklin. These Confederates. What kind of perspective are you taking in your book then for Franklin? Are you writing from the perspective of Claiborne, Hood? How you kind of?
I jump around. I've got Hood. I've got Hood, Cheatham, Forrest, and Claiborne. When Hood and Forrest is arguing at the. If I wasn't trying to say the name of the house, it's
the
still
house.
there.
Yeah, on the other side of the hill. Yeah, I know some of. Yeah.
Yeah. 2 Confederate generals died in that house.
Really?
They're arguing. Forrest doesn't want to attack. Then finally, Claiborne has heard. Well, if I can back up just a little bit, that morning, you know about the great arguments at Rippavilla. When you were down there, did you get to go to Rippavilla?
I didn't, but I drove past the house at the other side of Winston Hill where the headquarters were for Hood.
Okay, yeah, I'm talking about back at Spring Hill where Rippavilla.
I didn't make it down to Spring Hill. Yeah.
Okay. Hood has breakfast that morning, and me and my wife love to go there. He actually says, "Send me Cheatham and Brown." So he knows. He knows. He knows which guy's to blame. He knows who dropped the ball. And so Cheatham arrives first. He's the corps commander. And Hood actually asked the lady of the house to step out of the room, and it gets ugly. And there's a ham table. It's still there. I always have to go see the ham table. Hood was beaten on the ham table so hard with his fist that they said the ham platter was jumping 3 feet into the air. I mean, 3 inches into the air almost. And he was furious at Cheatham because he let him get away. Well, Cheatham diverts the blame to Claiborne. He says, well, Claiborne got some troops on his flank and had to turn. You remember we were talking about that. He had to move to the right, which he did. And then he tries to shift the blame to Bate, and Hood says, don't blame Bate. I told Bate to go take the pike, and you ordered him away. So when he gets done with Cheatham, he leaves, and Cheatham's riding across the field, and here comes Brown, and they meet, and Brown goes, what's going on? Because you don't get called to headquarters unless you're in trouble. And Cheatham says, one of Cheatham's staff officers says, you better be careful. He's as wrathy as a rattlesnake this morning. So Brown gets there, and Hood tells Brown, says, you were given orders to go in, you didn't go in. And now, when an enemy is retreating, he says, if you get there with your division, hit him. If you only get there with a brigade, I want you to hit him. And if you only have a regiment when you get there, hit him anyway. I mean, he's furious. So Brown leaves. And before this happens, before Hood goes in the house, he had also called for Forrest, which I'm sure you know enough about Forrest. And one thing, I love writing Forrest because you can say anything you want. Because if it weren't for 4-letter words, Forrest couldn't have spoken a sentence, period. But he arrives and rips into the Hood. Okay, now you're looking at Forrest, who's a major general. He's 2 grades below the commanding general, and he rips into Hood and tells him, if you weren't no cripple, I'd take you out behind the shed and whoop your ass right now. Yeah, and Hood does not say a word. And Forrest says, are you going to pursue? And Hood says, yes. He says, okay, well, I'll take my cavalry and I'll go on. And Forrest was a great general, but he was not a great subordinate. And he didn't put up with this West Point foolish stuff. He only went to the 6th grade, and everything he did was common sense. And he loved to fight these guys from West Point because he knew what they were going to do before they did it. So anyway, they arrive at Franklin. On the way, Claiborne hears that he thinks a rumor gets passed down that Hood's blaming him for what happened the day before. So he gets really depressed, and he's frustrated. So when he's called to the house at Winstead Hill to the meeting, and he's asked his opinion, he just says it don't look good. But he won't say anything else. And Cheatham's arguing against it, and Forrest is arguing against it. And Forrest is saying, give me a division of infantry, I'll flank them. I'll move across the river, we'll flank them out of those works, and they'll have to retreat to Nashville. But that's the problem. Nashville, there's 2 cities that have been entrenched since 1861 or 2, and there's no stronger position than the works around Nashville except for Washington. Hood knows if they get there, it's up. The game's up. I mean, he's got these guys with their back to a river. If he could just break them, it's over. He can wipe him out right there. He can wipe Schofield out right there at Frankland. And he realizes that if Schofield gets those bridges fixed and gets his army across and gets to Nashville, it's over. There is no hope. And that's what he's looking at. It's easy to be an armchair historian and say, that was really stupid.
But
Lee did the same thing at Gettysburg. People don't accuse him of being on drugs or,
But really quick for listeners, let's set up that there's what, 2 bridges out of Frankland going to the north?
Yeah, a railroad bridge and another bridge, and both of them are damaged.
Both are damaged. Both are almost impassable except for a single walkway for troops, I think is what I saw.
And he's trying to get his supply wagons across.
Right, he's got 300 supply wagons he's trying to get across. He's trying to get 25,000 men across these bridges, and he's got his back to the river. This is a big river. You can't just ford across it. There are fords, but they are not directly to the federal rear. So the Union had their backs to the river, and Hood sees this from his heights. There's this hill that's almost like a prominence above the battlefield. He's looking down on the Union troops with their backs to the river, and it's the afternoon now, 2:30, 3 o'clock. They're having these meetings discussing if they're going to attack or not. So
yeah, and actually by the time he gets everybody in position, he's got about an hour and a half, 2 hours before dark. Yeah. And he's hoping he can, and it could have worked. It really could have worked. The federal commanders made a mistake. They dug a main line. They dug a retrench line, which was good. That helped. But they left Wagner's division about 300 yards in front of the main position, and they had no entrenching tools. So all they could do is stack up rocks or whatever they could find to try to make breastworks. And when 20,000 Confederate troops come off that hill, they're going to be flanked on both sides. And they keep sending orders back. Hey, we need to go fall back to the main line. We're sitting ducks out here. And Wagner, who's intoxicated, he's their commander. Of course, he's in the main line, and he's telling them, stay out there and fight. Y'all can fight them. Stay out there and fight.
Right.
So when those 20,000 men come off that hill, they are almost gobbled up. They get off one shot, and they retreat. And Claiborne, it happens to be Claiborne's division and Brown's division that hit them, and Claiborne yells, go into the works with them. He sees this is perfect. So they're actually, the Confederates charged, they're racing toward the main line mixed with the retreating Federal troops. And so the Federal troops in the main line can't open fire because they're going to hit their own guys. And they wait until the last minute. When they get within less than 100 yards, they finally just decide, hey, we've got to do it. They open fire on everybody out there. But it was too late, and they overran that position and went all the way to the retrench line, went all the way to the Carter House, and Updike's brigade just happened to be back there. And I've got this in the book. Updike and Wagner argue. Updike's in Wagner's division. And when he's the rear guard, and as he comes in, Wagner says, form your brigade out here with these guys. And Wagner said, no, that's suicide. So he just marches right, and they argue all the way back past the Carter House. And Wagner finally gives up and says, well, go on and fight where you please. We know you'll fight. And just gives up.
Yeah, but really quick.
Updike had tried to convince him, this is a disaster.
Yeah, really quick. Updike, he's the colonel of the 125th Ohio, and then he moved into brigade commander for the Battle of Frankland. And that story is very interesting, is that Updike's kind of coming in. They did form a rear guard on Winstead Hill, where Hood, at first, and then they realized that, hey, we're not going to be able to hold this rear guard. Let's retreat backwards. And as Updike's marching up the road towards Frankland to the north, Wagner orders him into the front line, right? And Updike's like, I'm not ordering my men. My men are tired. They're hungry. They've been up all night, and they argue all the way, almost 200 yards, all the way back to where Updike.
At least.
It sits them down, and they're swearing all the stories that I heard. They were swearing all the way up and down that road, and Updike just looked.
Through the main line. These guys are digging in. They're coming through the main line. Yep. Here's these two generals cussing and raising hell at each other, and everybody just kind of stops what they're doing and just watches the parade go by. Right. But now Updike's another one of those redheads, and he's been the rear guard, and he's been asking Wagner, okay, my men are tired, swap a brigade. Usually that's how it worked. You'd be a rear guard so long, then somebody else would relieve you. Well, Wagner was drinking, and he'll be all right. Not going to send him any. I'm not going to relieve him. So when he gets on Winstead Hill and actually sets up, Stewart's corps is in the lead, which is how they end up on the right flank. When they get there and see those troops, they don't know how many's there. It's a brigade. They just move to the right and go right around his flank. So he has to abandon the hill.
Yeah.
There was a rumor circulated that Hood put Cheatham's division in the center, in the worst place to punish them for what happened at Spring Hill. This is not true. It was because, and I'm going to tell you, nobody got any worse place than A.P. Stewart's corps, because, like I said, Claiborne and Brown actually hit that front line, and that softened the blow on them. The guys on the far right under Stewart, and my grandpa, I cover my grandpa, he's in that charge. He goes in. They hit, you've heard of the Osage Orange Abattis?
Yes. But explain,
it's weird because
explain to the listeners really quick what kind of tree that is.
Okay, it's weird because the male and the female look nothing alike.
The trees.
But
You mean the trees? The trees?
The trees, yeah.
Okay.
The male looks more like an oak than the female. The female Osage Orange has these limbs that bow and bow. The Indians actually, that's what they made their bow and arrows out of, because the limbs bow as they grow. And you can cut these down and form a perfect, what they called back then, an abattis. It's they pile them together, limbs sticking towards the enemy, and they put them about 20 yards in front of their main line, and then they're entrenched breastworks. Breastworks were about chest high, except the Federals at this point had taken rocks and set rocks on top of the breastworks, cut down logs and put logs on top of the rocks, so you've got about a 3-inch gap that you can shoot him through. And they're running their barrels beneath that log over the dirt, and you're trying to fight through those trees just to get at them. And the only way to shoot one of them is shoot through that 3-inch gap between the dirt and the log.
Which relates to a nice story from, I think, the daughter Lots, maybe, or one of the daughters was saying that most of the wounds to the Federal troops were head wounds.
Yeah, exactly, because they were entrenched. Exactly. And my grandpa was in Company B, 35th Alabama Infantry. They were in Loring's division on the far right in Scott's brigade. They were the extreme right flank, and they went in, and they were taking fire from the artillery in the fort to the right across the Harpeth River, and they actually make it to the Osage Orange trees, and the captain is like 21 years old. There's 24 guys in this company, and he's hacking away with a sword trying to break through when he's shot twice, mortally wounded. But out of 24 guys in that company that made that charge, there were only 2 unwounded. That's how bad it was over there.
Are we good? Do we have to read the book to find out about your grandfather?
Yeah, and the sad part about it is, he goes on to he's wounded, but he goes on to Nashville, and he survives that.
Okay.
But to be honest with you, I don't know if he survived it. He may be in an unknown grave area in the Confederate Cemetery of Franklin, because all I know is he went to the war and he didn't come home. But I told the guy that read my book, he said, did your grandpa really, make it? And I said, I don't know, but after I put him through so much, I just couldn't kill him.
Yeah. No,
when you go to them, I put them in parts of it, and it gives you a perspective of what these, the private soldiers went through, the hardships and just the things they saw. It was really ugly.
So you got chapters. You got chapters that kind of flash to him and give his perspective of what they're going through. Good. Yeah.
I go to his company, and a lot of what I'm gonna tell you how bad I've got it. My wife loves cemeteries. There's so much history in a cemetery.
Sure. Yes.
There's Joseph Nicholas Thompson was a corporal in that company, and he actually lost his leg at Franklin. and he writes a letter about what all he went through at Franklin and what he saw, and that's what I use to show what my grandpa said.
Okay.
And he actually wrote this letter, and he talks about being carried back to the corn plantation, and there was no room inside, and he's laid outside. And the next day, they cut his leg off at the knee and throw it on a pile of arms and legs, and he lays there and looks at his leg, for the rest of the day after they've cut it off. But this guy comes back, he becomes a doctor after the war, and he writes this letter. So we take this letter. He's buried in Tuscumbia. We take this letter and we go sit down on his grave and read the letter, me and my wife together. But it was really good. There's only one guy from Company B buried in the cemetery up there that I could find, and that's the captain. And there are no more. And I find in this letter, at the end of the letter, this guy says, Robert Wheeler, the color bearer, he's carrying the flag for the 35th. He's killed. His dad actually went to the cemetery after the war and dug up all the guys from Company B and brought them back to Tuscumbia and buried them in the unknown section. And so that's why the captain's the only one that's still up there. The rest of them were brought back here. And I was always, before I did all this research, I'd go in there and I'm like, man, them guys got wiped out. Why are there none of them? And I just assumed they're probably in an unknown grave, And then I find out this guy goes up and brings them home.
Isn't that interesting that they actually, a lot of the Confederates also were taken back home, even though there's 1,200 or something in that cemetery?
There's
yeah, most of them were dug up and actually taken back home.
1450, I believe, 1350 in that cemetery, and,
Yep.
and a lot of them were brought home, which means that we're about 95% sure that the casualty counts were much higher than what Hood told. Hood smoothed it over. He tells Richmond that we won a great battle here, but we did lose 6 generals in the process. Which we didn't lose 6 generals. What he lost was he had 6 generals killed, 6 wounded, and 1 captured. So he lost 13 generals basically.
Yeah, it's just amazing the command and control that was lost in less than 3 hours, if you think about it. For
He
listeners,
destroyed his army.
do I?
He destroyed his army basically.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I've heard arguments saying, well, they weren't destroyed. Well, they may as well have been.
So, just for listeners' sake, because a lot of listeners probably haven't heard of this battle except for kind of my discussions, but this battle is so bloody that it starts at 4:30, ends by 9 o'clock, 9:30. Right, so most of it, 3/4 of it's fought at night because it gets dark in Tennessee about this time, about 5:30. It's fought from 5:30 to about 9:30, no less, and by that time the Federal Army pulls out about 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. This battle is short, 3 hours. 3 hours.
Yep, but they say it was a 5-hour battle. There was shooting for 5 hours, but the worst of it was over in the first hour. I mean that's how it was bad. Now Johnson's division arrives well after dark, and he sends them in on the far left flank. Now check this out. If they can't keep their line straight in the dark, so you take a guy on each end of each regiment, and he holds a torch in his hand, so that the guys can look from their left to their right at the torches and make sure they're in line as they go into battle. How would you like to be the guy carrying the torch?
A torch, yeah. Carrying the torch for the end of to the end of the battle line, and then going into combat into men who are ready for you to come into combat.
Oh yeah, waiting.
Yeah.
And they actually go in. Of course, they get the same result. And General Brantley from Mississippi, Hood sends out an order and says, "Get your troops reformed and be prepared to attack at first light." And this staff officer rides up to General Brantley, who's under a tree crying like a baby, and he says, General Hood says, reform your men for an attack at first light. And the general, he does not hear a word. He's just it's like he's gone.
Yeah.
And so he repeats the order about 3 times, and finally Brantley turns around and he says, "I have no men left." And he says, "Well, you got to have a few." And he says, "My brigade is gone." And finally the guy says, well, if you're not going to at least get up and make the attempt, I'll have to arrest you. And they said, he sat there a little bit, and he finally gets up and says, I'll see what I can find, and staggers off into the dark. But it was just, that's how bad it was. It was one of the worst brigades was a Missouri brigade under Cockrell. And they went in with about 1,200 men, and they had less than, I'd say they had probably 450 when it's over.
Yeah.
Part of their line struck the part of the federal line that had the repeating rifles, Henry rifles, which was basically like a 30-30 today, just as fast as you can operate the lever, pull a trigger.
Yeah, 15 shots a minute. 10 shots a minute. And the put it in perspective, the right flank of the Confederates got a couple things happening to them. Just for the listeners' sake, the lines became, it's almost like a funnel where the lines became smashed together as they got closer to the Union lines. And as that happened, also the heavy guns or the rifled guns from the Fort Granger across the river were firing plunging fire on top of the Henry repeating rifles and artillery guns in the lines. It was I think at that Carrington Confederate cemetery, they have the most, I think the Missourians have the most dead buried there, actually. So out of all the states that have Confederate states troops that are there. So for listeners, this is probably one of the most bloodiest battles, as you're saying, that part by the Cotton Gin and that angle and where Claiborne's division hit the line is probably one of the bloodiest areas. I think the one part of a battle that I can think of that would give the most competition to that would be the bloody angle at Spotsylvania, which was
there you go.
As bloody. I've been to Spotsylvania. I've walked that terrain also. Same idea at Spotsylvania. It actually rained, and it was just a bloody mess. Think of Cold Mountain, the movie Cold Mountain, the beginning, kind of that idea. It was just a bloody mess. Same idea. So Franklin is just this hidden battle that was almost wanted to be forgotten by a lot of people. So
there were so many bodies in that ditch that they found guys dead. Well, Colonel Stafford of a Tennessee regiment was found dead, sitting straight up, his chin on his chest. He couldn't even fall over. He was wedged among all the bodies. And they said, that the outside of the breastworks were about 6 feet deep and about 6 feet across, and it was just level with bodies.
Yeah, and the Confederates keep in mind, listeners, that the Confederate Army at this time are, just like you said before, are veterans. These men, we can talk about Pickett's charge as almost the same example, but this is a bigger charge than Pickett's charge. The men are all veterans in this army.
They're the best of the best.
Best of the best.
The deserters and the cowards, they're all gone.
They're all gone.
I mean, these are the guys that want it.
Yeah, and there's stories about Pickett's charge where entire brigades came out of the woods and turned around and went back into the woods and just didn't do the charge. There wasn't one part of these regiments or brigades that did not go forward. So yeah.
And I've stood on that hill and thought, I don't know.
So perfect. Let's go ahead. Let's save a little bit. Let's take a break here. We'll come back with Nashville and some more stuff after break.
Okay, doke.
Welcome, listeners, back from the break. We're going to continue on with a little bit of Franklin. We took a little break there just to kind of recollect our senses and get back to it. Just to relate a quick story, my great uncle, maybe even greater uncles than that, on my wife's side was in the 7th Ohio Cavalry, who was stationed on the left flank on the other side of the river, facing off against Forrest's cavalry during this battle also. So I have a little bit of a personal connection also. So it seems like both you and Tim and I have met on the battlefield before with our relatives. So,
well, now, my distant cousin was on the right flank under Forrest.
Here we go.
It's a good chance that your uncle took a pop shot at his grandpa.
You're probably right.
I'll have to tell him about that.
Yeah, I have to. I'll pull the enlistment record, but the enlistment record was 7th Ohio Cavalry, stationed with them and fought all the way through the war for the 7th Ohio Cavalry. Okay. So, anyways, it's good. Hey, cover for us really quick some of the fighting around the Carter House. There's a famous general here that was at the battle, or famous general's dad, actually, that a lot of people don't know about. That if this general wasn't born, the entire Pacific War in World War II would have been a lot different. So tell us a little bit about him too.
Douglas MacArthur's father. He's I'm wanting to say he was a lieutenant colonel. Am I wrong?
I think so. Yeah, he was the. He
meets right in front of, in the street in front of the Carter House. He meets a Confederate major, and they think he's a Texas major, and they're not 100% sure. Some people think he's an Arkansas guy, but they meet in hand-to-hand combat, and MacArthur has a sword, and the Confederate major has a pistol. And as they come face to face, the Confederate fires first and hits MacArthur in the chest. MacArthur takes the sword and runs it through the Confederate major. And as the Confederate major is going to the ground, he sticks the pistol right against MacArthur's knee and pulls the trigger. And of course, Confederate major's dead. They load up MacArthur and they say, well, this is probably mortal. He's been shot basically in the knee, shot through a lung, but he survives. He's carried to the rear and survives. That happened directly in front of the Carter House. The things that went on around that Carter House, it's some of it's almost impossible to talk about. If you can tour it today, and I recommend at least once in your lifetime go tour the Carter House and the corn plantation across the way, but especially the Carter House. It has the most battle damaged building that still stands from the war, and if I'm not mistaken, it's like almost 400 bullet holes in the guy's farm office. And then beside that is a smokehouse, and the bricks are all damaged. And you can look at the main house and tell where so many bullets hit. There's still a cannonball hole in the eave on the back L of the house. There's bullets by the back door. You can put your finger in there and still feel the bullets. And these were all fired from the Confederate side. In the backyard, there's an area of about 30 feet by 30 feet. And they said there were 80 bodies in that area the next morning. And you got to think there's 20-something people in the basement of this house while this is raging going on. And it makes you wonder what was going through their minds. Actually, the Loatzes, they came over. Anybody nearby came over and went in the basement because he had a basement, basically, a cellar. It was actually a 3-room cellar. You get to go down there and see where they huddled. In the front yard, and it's probably 20 yards from the front door to the street. There were 40-something bodies between that front door and the street. I've read where one guy said that he saw a guy bayonet a guy, and before he could pull it out, another guy hits him in the head. They didn't use the bayonet much. Most of the time they would, how big the muskets were, they would turn them around and use them like a club. And he said before the guy could get the bayonet out of the other guy, this guy had just splattered this guy's brains on everybody within about 5 feet of him. Actually, a Confederate colonel was bayoneted to death on those steps. And the next day, Fountain Branch Carter was the old man, but his son was Moscow Carter. He'd been a Confederate Confederate captain, but he'd been furloughed because he'd been shot in the leg. He walked with a limp. And he actually went around and said that he scraped up a half a bushel basket of brains off those front steps. that are still there from how violent it was. And I mean, you just kind of have to let your imagination go with what happened around that house. It was ugly. There was a guy laying on the ground shooting, a Union soldier, and his captain comes up behind him and says, "Stand up and fight like a man." And just as soon as the words comes out of his mouth, a bullet hits him between the eyes, and whop, he hits the ground. And the guy laying on the ground turns around and says, "Why don't you stand up and fight like a man?"
Yeah,
I guess in that kind of situation, you got to make the light of it.
Yeah, it turns into that morbid humor where you're just like, it's so extreme. It's almost a game, It's almost like it's not real. So yeah, I really believe, from what I've read, that these guys, especially in the Confederate, in the Union Army, they had so many men that you might see action at Shiloh, and then you may go somewhere and guard a town for 3 months, and then you may go see action in another battle, and then you may be off for a few months. The Confederate Army is the same guys, the same regiments, because we didn't have guys to, rotate in and out. So it's the same guys in every battle. And from the way I've read way a lot of these guys write, it's like, okay, I'm dead. And when I survive a battle, well, that's just one more I survive. But, eventually I'm dead. I mean, that's the way they looked at it. I mean, it's just a matter of when. And I believe they finally got to the point to where it's just, I'm a dead man. That's no doubt about it. I mean, seeing all these guys die, you've read, I don't know if you're familiar with Sam Watkins' book. He wrote Company H. No, I don't. No, but continue.
They left in 1861 with about 110 men in their company, Company H, 1st Tennessee Infantry, and I think 6 of them got home.
Wow.
Stuff like that, like my grandpa in the 35th, they started out with 105, 6 men, and the best I can tell now, like I said, there were only 2 unwounded, but there were 4 walk-in wounded that were able to continue. So 6 of them went to Nashville out of a company which has a captain and supposed to have 100 men.
Yeah, it's just the attrition factor for the Confederates. A company is usually 100 men, and a regiment's 1,000 men was the traditional number. But now you're talking about numbers where a company is only 6 men, a regiment could actually be 100 men. I mean, it's just the attrition and the understrength regiments of the Confederates is just amazing how many men.
Nobody to replace them.
Yeah.
And so these guys, and I'll tell you something else that I've just recently discovered by studying so many of these Confederate generals after the war. Either there's several of them that drank themselves to death. There's several committed suicide. And if they didn't do one of those things, there were a whole bunch of them that became preachers.
Yeah. I think that's the normal way for those who've been in combat for any era is almost the PTSD or the mental effects of being in combat.
Exactly.
Just completely changes yourself, and same can be said for my uncle who fought for the 1st Marine Division and landed at Peleliu. He became a preacher for the Methodist Church afterwards in Florida because of the experiences that he had in the 1st Marine Division at Guadalcanal, New Britain, and Peleliu. I think it's the same for almost any period of war for those veterans.
And like especially if you're a general, these are your men. You're supposed to take care of your men. That's what you're taught, and you're watching them get wiped out over 4 years of time, just continuously. I mean, what that would do to a man.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. So these Confederates, they wake up December 1st, isn't it? December 1st, they wake up. The Union Army's gone. All the there's just men laying all over the field of battle. They've taken the field, these Confederates have, but the Union Army has retreated, and it was actually a Union win, is my understanding, even though the Confederates retained the battlefield. So,
yeah. The rule back then was whoever left the battlefield lost, but you couldn't call this a victory.
Right, exactly. So this is a victory that Hood went in with 35,000 men and lost close to 5,000 or 8,000 men right there very quickly. So the Confederates then decide, as you said, they have to get up. They have, was that General Brantley said, you have to go find your brigade, get your men sorted. We're going to pursue the enemy, right? And that's what happened the next day.
The next day, he leaves Cheatham's corps behind because they're the ones that are pretty decimated the most, or he thinks are, to bury the dead. And S.D. Lee and A.P. Stewart move on up to the outskirts of Nashville. And then Cheatham follows a few days later.
Sure. So then you got the Confederates putting a siege to Nashville with less men than the Union Army, right?
Yeah, exactly. But actually, he that's a misconception. Hood's plan was not a siege. He and I go into this in the book. He takes Bates' division and Forrest's cavalry, and he says, there's like 7,000 men in Murfreesboro, and he says, go down there, act like you're going to gobble them up, and Thomas is going to come out on my right flank and march down to save them, and I'm going to hit him in the flank as he goes by. So he puts his strongest corps, which is S.D. Lee's, who hasn't seen much action at all, on the right to deal with that. Except the only problem is Bate was in that horrific fighting at Frankland, so he's got little strength at all. And Forrest has got cavalry, and they're not strong enough. Forrest doesn't have probably 4,000 men. They're not strong enough to do anything but go down there and demonstrate. And Thomas doesn't take the bait. He sits right there and says, if you want them, you can have them. I'm not coming out of these breastworks, out of these trenches. And he formulates a plan to make a feint on Hood's left, which would be the east side where S.D. Lee, the strongest corps, is. And then with the majority of his army, he's going to hit Hood on the right, on Hood's left, his right.
Yeah.
And the problem is, that's A.P. Stewart and Cheatham who have been demolished at Franklin. So he hits them in the worst possible place. And Hood had the option of Lieutenant General Richard Taylor told him, said, I can send you a brigade of Texans up there to replenish your losses. And Hood said, we can drop back to Columbia and get those, a brigade, maybe 2,000 men at most if it's a large brigade, and then go to Nashville, or we can go on. So he chose just to go on. And he said, and if we do drop back to Columbia to get those men, they're going to move back down to Franklin, and we're going to have to go through all that again. So he moves on up with what he's got. But by this point, you're looking at George Thomas has got about 70,000 men in Nashville, and I'd say Hood was lucky if he had 25,000 men on the scene at this point. And when he makes that attack, the first day he pushes Hood back a couple miles, and then he does the exact same thing the next day, and it's just and the army finally breaks. The only part of the army that halfway stuck together was S.D. Lee's corps because they hadn't seen much. But the neat part was when he calls Forrest in and says, look, it's over. I need your help. Can you get me out of here? And I've got this in the book. Forrest actually says, I need to see General Walthall. Now, General Walthall's from Mississippi. He's not a well-known. He's a division commander, but he's not really well-known. And so he's getting called to headquarters, and he's thinking, what in the world have I done? I'm in trouble, And he gets there, and Forrest tells Hood, says, you give me Walthall's division with my cavalry, and I'll save your ass, basically. And so that's he takes Walthall's men, and I can't remember how many men Walthall had in his division, but 1,600 of them didn't even have shoes. And this is one of the worst winters on record. And Forrest says, okay, I'll tell you what, dude. Put those guys in wagons, and we'll let them ride in wagons, and then whenever we have to, they can get out and fight. And he covers the withdrawal, the retreat, all the way back. But there is an interesting side note to this. Now, Forrest had a problem with people with education. he felt like they looked down their nose at him. So he arrives at the Duck River at the same time as Cheatham does. And Forrest is about to cross over, and Cheatham ranks him. Cheatham's a lieutenant general at this point. Forrest's a major general. And Cheatham tells him, says, I'm going to cross my corps first. And Forrest takes it as an insult. He says, well, if you're a better man than me, you can. And Cheatham says, well, I'm giving you a direct order. And Forrest pulls his pistol and sticks it in Cheatham's chest and says, I'm crossing first. And so Cheatham's men raise their rifles at Forrest. Forrest's men start raising their rifles at Cheatham's men. And here we are with two Confederate units about to open fire on each other at the Duck River, just because Forrest took it that Cheatham was trying to say he was better than him. And just so happened S.D. Lee arrives at that point, and he pulls them apart and tells everybody to calm down, and he takes Cheatham aside and talks to him a little bit, and if I remember correctly, Forrest crosses his men first while S.D. Lee's talking to Cheatham, but it almost got ugly.
Wow. And it's just the pressure situation. These men are under such pressure.
Yeah.
They just had two serious traumatic events where so many men have been lost over the last month, and they just want to get back. They're done.
Yeah.
Absolutely done.
Yeah. And the amazing part is Hood carried about 38,000 men on this campaign, and it lasts just a little over a month. Oh no, it lasts a month actually.
Yeah.
And when he gets back, he doesn't stop till he gets to Tupelo, and he can only count 17,000 men.
Can you imagine? Just stragglers, wounded and killed, 20,000 men gone.
I mean, most of them at this point realize, hey, it's up, it's over. There's no point. People going home.
Yeah.
But those survivors, they end up going to the Carolinas and fighting Sherman under Johnston, which wasn't much of a fight, but that was really the end of it. I mean, I've got people, there's pro-Hood people that's, oh no, he didn't destroy the army, but I don't see how you can, there was nothing left.
Yeah, Nashville was just the backbreaker for them, because that was the first time where the Confederate Army actually had routed and just completely ran off the battlefield. So
exactly. And you lost Claiborne, the best division commander in that army, and he would have probably been a lieutenant general had it not been for either the fact that he was foreign born, or because he earned it, or it was because of the fact that he said, let's free the slaves and arm them and let them fight, and we will run out of men.
Yeah.
And that caused such backlash that he never got promoted. Plus, Bragg didn't like him because, he was Hardy's best friend, and Hardy and Bragg argued, so that gave him and when Bragg was relieved, unfortunately, he was not fired or demoted. He was promoted to Davis's personal advisor, which meant that any promotions that came in the Army of Tennessee were some of Bragg's buddies.
Yeah,
it didn't matter
politics.
If you were qualified. It were these old vendettas,
Yeah. No, it's interesting.
But you lose Claiborne he's shot in the heart, right near the cotton gin. Granberry is shot under the left eye in the cheek, in the middle of the road. He goes to his knees, puts his hands to his face, and his body freezes up. He's actually found in that position the next morning. John Adams, he was shot. He was hit a total of 9 times. And his last words, they apologized for killing him, and he said, it's the fate of an officer to die for his country. That was his last words.
And he's the famous general with his horse astride the ditch.
Yeah, the horse landed on the breastworks with his leg trapped underneath, and they pulled him out.
Yeah.
And let's see, you had Strahl on the left. He was in the breastworks loading muskets, passing them up to privates when he was hitting the neck. And he's hitting the neck, and he's crawling to Colonel Cunningham to tell him that you're in charge now. I'm out of commission. But Cunningham had been killed. He's the guy that was sitting straight up with his chin on his chest because he couldn't fall over. When these three privates decide, hey, this is our way out of this hellhole. We'll grab Straw and carry him to the rear. So they grab him up, and they take off to the rear with him when there's another volley, and one hits Straw in the body, one blows the back of his head out, killing him instantly, and all three of the guys that are carrying him are killed.
Ugh.
And General Carter is gut shot. He's carried back to the Harrison home, where he'll die a few days later. And General Gist was shot in the leg, in the thigh, but continued and was hit in the lung, and they carried him back to this lady's house, and he died sometime during the night there. So there's 6 generals killed, 1 captured, and 6 more wounded. It was just devastating.
It's amazing as I'm thinking of these stories. How do these stories get passed down about these generals and in the kind of first person accounts like that? How does that pass down?
Yeah, after the war, they started this Southern Historical Society, and these soldiers would write in their stories. And this trying to remember the guy's name, Sumner Cunningham was a corporal. He was beside of Straw when he got shot in the neck, and he said that Straw was actually loading the rifles and passing to him. He had asked Straw twice, should we surrender, and he said, keep firing. And this might interest you. General Straw was born in Ohio.
You know what? I think he was born in Worthington, Ohio, and his house still stands today. I think I just drove past it last week.
Really?
Yes.
That's pretty neat.
I think it's Strahl.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
I'll take a picture, send it to you. I think his house is still standing.
I appreciate that.
I just talked to a friend who was in town and told him I think there's a Confederate general from Columbus, but I can't think of his name, and you just mentioned it, and I think that's the guy. So
I know of 2 Confederate generals from Ohio. The other one was Bushrod Johnson.
Okay.
He was from Ohio, and he ends up marrying a woman from Tennessee is how he got here. Now, Strahl, actually, his grandmother was from Tennessee, and as soon as I believe he came to Tennessee and went to law school and became a lawyer in Dyersburg.
Mm-hmm.
That's how he ended up fighting for the Confederacy. But, yeah, that's how a lot of these stories got passed down, and then a lot of them was, they had the United Confederate Veterans, and they would write down their personal stories for articles for that. And Claiborne's staff officers wrote about his death. The Union troops wrote about Adams' death.
Yeah, sure.
So, that's a lot of how it comes down. Now, a lot of this stuff, it's kind of comedic because, and it happened on both sides. But now General Updike, he's behind his men in line, Colonel Updike, I'm sorry. And every time one of them starts to get out of line, gets scared and starts to run, he'll take his pistol, he's got it by the barrel, and he'll strike the guy over the head with it to make him get back in line. And he does this until he breaks the wooden handle grips break completely out of the pistol.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And now, if you look at there's a painting, I believe Don Trelawney done.
Yeah, I saw. Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
And you see Updike beating these Confederate soldiers over the head with his pistol.
Yeah.
That didn't happen. Updike, about 10 years after the war, decides, I think it sounds better if I'm beating Confederates over the head than my own men. So he changes his story. But his the very first thing, and I believe it's in his official report, was that anybody that got scared and tried to run out of the line, he hit them on the head. He was behind the line. And then 10 years later, he decided, that don't make me look all that good. And so a lot of stuff, I'll give you another example. Why is Chamberlain so famous at Gettysburg?
Yeah, for his counterattack.
No, because he lived 40 years after the war and wrote these great stories about himself. Him and Marcus Spears, his major, argued after the war that half of what he told wasn't true.
Wow.
He said, Spears said that the Confederate Army, and if you read Colonel Oates, the Alabama guy's report, and Chamberlain's report,
yeah,
you wouldn't even think they're on the same field together. Colonel Oates said, I was down 50% casualties. He said, I told him, I said, next time the fire slackens, I'm going to give the signal and we're going to run. And at that point, Marcus Spears, the major, said, there was a little slackening in the fire. The Confederates run, and he said, without orders, our men just sprang up and chased them. He said, we never got no fancy left wheel charge maneuver that Chamberlain claimed he invented on the spot. He said, we never got an order to charge. He said, the men just did it on their own when they ran. So, I mean, it's a lot of that. If you read General Liddell's book, he's a Confederate general, he was just a brigade commander under Claiborne, but according to him, he told General Bragg every battle plan he ever did. He's the one that told him how to do it. A lot of these guys, if they live long enough, their memory starts getting a little bit off.
Yeah. No, it's good. It's good stories. It's good stuff to kind of get that perspective. The perspective of Franklin, Spring Hill, Nashville. There's a lot of stuff we can't cover in a podcast, but you definitely gave us the taste of the Civil War to go out and grab your book and get that perspective of what these generals were thinking and how they were making these decisions. Really quick, where can we find the book? How can we find you? Where do we go?
You can order it from Blue Water Publishing, or it's on Amazon. It sells in Books A Million, but only in the states around Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi. For some reason, they didn't think it would do well outside of these states where everything occurred.
Sure.
But but you could probably order. I'm sure you can order it from Books A Million. But they're on Amazon. And that's pretty much it, I guess.
Good. No, it's good. They find it on Amazon. Die Like Men by Tim Kent, the author. It's a good book. I don't have it yet, but it is on my to-buy list for this year because I love good historical fiction. Any last thoughts on this Nashville, Spring Hill, even the Civil War campaign? Any last thoughts before we say adios?
I got there's a place called Shies Hill in Nashville, and it was where I failed to mention this story. It was where Brigadier General Thomas Benton Smith, Confederate general from Tennessee, he's on that hill. He's in Bates Division, 20th Tennessee, and they're overran. There is a Colonel McMillan from Ohio who is intoxicated. And General Smith surrenders. When McMillan steps forward, draws his sword, and starts striking Smith over the head with it to the point that his brain is exposed. And these guys are begging him to stop. So they finally carry him back into Nashville as prisoners. And General Smith, the doctors say, look, we're looking right at his brain. He's not going to make it. He actually lives to be 80-something years old, but he spends the last 40-something years in an insane asylum. But also on that hill was a Colonel Shy of the 20th Tennessee. He was bent over picking up a musket when a bullet strikes him in the head. And for some reason, because these guys have put up such a fierce fight, the Union troops are extremely irritated. They strip his clothes off of him, he's dead, and they bayonet him to a tree. Well, this girl, I can't remember her name, she comes and gets the body, cleans it up. A lady from Franklin comes and gets the body, takes it to her husband, who preserves it in arsenic in a cast iron casket. They they bury him, and then in the 1970s, there's a report that someone's disturbed a grave, and he was buried behind his plantation house. So they show up, and they find this guy laying on top of the casket, and they say, okay, there's been a murder. Someone's tried to shove this body. The head's gone, but it's got a tuxedo on. They've tried to shove it through the glass window in the front of the casket. And so they send it to the scientists over the body farm at the University of Tennessee, and the skull was inside the casket. And he says, okay, this guy was 27 years old. He was 5'9", weighed about 160 pounds. He died of a gunshot to the skull, and he's been dead, about 6 weeks. Come to find out, it was Colonel Shy.
Oh, my.
That's how well the guy preserved him. And so the family takes him and reburies him. But you can go at the Carnton Plantation Museum, and they have that casket in there, which is really, really cool. It looks like something Dracula probably would have used, but that's just an interesting side story about. But I will give you some professional advice. Anybody that goes to Shies Hill to visit, make sure you wear off, because I had chiggers all the way up past my knees. I will never go back up there without off.
And on that note, well, no chiggers, take your off, and we're done with the podcast. Thanks so much, Tim.
All right, Rob, thanks for having me.
Thank you, listeners, for grabbing this episode of History to Wargames podcast. If you like more depth into this podcast, maybe pictures, maps of a battlefield walks, or even some inspirational painting, please head over to the Facebook group and join our group, which is called History to Wargames podcast. This group has lots of pictures, history visits, videos, all those kind of sorts of things that you might be interested in on top of the podcast to give you more background knowledge to something we've covered in a podcast. So please definitely go over to iTunes, leave us a review, check us out, leave us a 5-star, 4-star, 3-star, 1-star, whatever it may be on us, so that we can kind of work our way up so more listeners can find us. Also, if you'd like to find us on Twitter, we're at BritYankHobPod and under the name Rob. So definitely check me out there too. There's also content we put on there for Twitter, also for those who follow Twitter. We look forward to hearing from you and look forward to having new friends join us each and every day, each and every week, each and every month. So definitely thanks for tuning in to History to Wargames podcast.